They said I was overreacting when I asked to keep a signed copy of my contract. 17 years later, that piece of paper became the weapon that brought a billion-dollar company to its knees. My name, erased from every patent, every project, until I made them pay rent to live in what I built. This isn't a story about luck. It's about remembering every word they hoped I'd forget. Stay until the end, and if you've ever been underestimated at work, subscribe and tell me how you'd fight back. I still remember the smell of solder and burned coffee that filled the old hangar we called a lab. It wasn't much, just 4 of us, 2 folding tables, and a promise that we'd build something the world hadn't seen before. The walls sweated in the summer and froze in the winter, but inside that space, I felt alive. I was 20, broke, and in love with machines that did what people said couldn't be done. I scavenged motors from scrapyards, coded through the night, and welded until my arms shook. Every click, every spark was a kind of prayer. We didn't have investors or polished slides, just prototypes held together by sheer will and duct tape. Marcus and the others would talk big about market disruption, while I lived in the quiet, meticulous world of gears and logic boards. I built the first autonomous control rig by hand, each servo calibrated with nothing but intuition and late-night caffeine. When it finally ran without error for 72 hours, I cried alone on the concrete floor. That was the moment I believed NovaForge Robotics could become real. They offered me 3% equity and a handshake that felt like friendship. I didn't care about the money then. I cared that someone believed in what I could build. The contract we signed that week was printed on cheap paper from an old dot matrix printer, the ink slightly uneven, but I read every clause, every line, twice. My grandmother used to say paper has a longer memory than people, and even then, I believed her. I asked for one clause to stay: ownership reversion if I was ever terminated without cause. Marcus laughed like I was playing lawyer, but he signed it anyway. Back then, we were all dreamers. Those early years were chaos and wonder. We worked 100 hours a week and still met for greasy diner breakfasts, sharing half-cold pancakes and impossible ideas. I slept on the office couch, woke up to the sound of air compressors, and never questioned it. Every improvement, every design tweak felt like a step towards something bigger than any of us. We were engineers first, founders second. When our first major client came, a small automotive parts manufacturer, we delivered a system that cut their downtime by 38%. The day they called it beautiful, I thought I'd finally made something that mattered. I was the only one who truly understood how it all worked, but that didn't bother me. I liked being the quiet one in the corner, the mind behind the machines. Back then, Marcus still asked my opinion. He'd stand beside me watching the prototypes come to life and say, "Ruby, you're the engine behind this company." I believed him. Maybe that was my first mistake, believing that loyalty meant permanence, that if I built something unshakable, it couldn't be taken away. I didn't know then that the foundation I was building would become the leverage I'd one day use to bring everything crashing down. The years that followed felt like living inside a storm you didn't want to escape. NovaForge grew faster than any of us could comprehend. What started as a cramped workshop became a gleaming facility with glass walls, corporate slogans, and a front desk that smelled like ambition. I moved from a folding chair to an actual office, though I still spent more time on the factory floor than behind a desk. My code was now driving entire production lines. What began as a single robotic arm turned into an adaptive automation framework capable of learning from its own mistakes, a first in the industry. The press called it a revolution. I called it Tuesday. I was building the systems that kept the company alive. There was pride in that, a quiet kind of satisfaction that didn't need headlines. Still, it was strange watching the founders slowly become strangers. Marcus traded his hoodies for suits, started using words like scalability and exit potential. The same man who once crashed on a cot beside me now spoke in investor-friendly metaphors. I told myself that was just success, that he was adapting to survive. Meanwhile, I stayed in the lab, refining algorithms and tightening control loops while the rest of the team chased quarterly milestones. I didn't need spotlights. I needed precision. Every line of code was a promise that the system wouldn't fail, that my work meant something real. As NovaForge expanded into aerospace and defense contracts, my inventions became the backbone of billion-dollar deals. I'd read the reports, see my name printed in the small type beneath Lead Systems Architect, and smile privately. That was enough, or so I thought. Then came the recognition phase, the stage every company hits where it starts pretending it invented itself. PR consultants polished our story until it gleamed, deleting the parts that didn't fit the myth. I noticed small things first. Product documentation that used to credit me by name now said NovaForge Engineering. Patent filings where I was listed as primary inventor suddenly appeared under team contributions. I mentioned it once during a meeting, half joking, and the room went quiet. Someone muttered that it was standardization for branding. Branding. That word hit me harder than I expected. I told myself not to make it a battle, that the work mattered more than the name attached to it. But something shifted that day. I started keeping copies of everything, drafts, submissions, emails. I didn't know exactly why, maybe instinct, maybe fear. Still, outwardly, I played the part. Promotions came, new titles with longer names but the same work. Senior Automation Architect, Director of Innovation Systems. It sounded glamorous, but the pressure was suffocating. I led a team of engineers who respected me, but didn't understand that every decision I made came from protecting what we built, not chasing market share. I began noticing how easily people were replaced. Old faces disappeared from the labs, their offices emptied overnight. The company newsletter would spin it as New Directions, but the truth was simpler. Marcus was cleaning house. I told myself I was safe. I'd been there from the beginning. My name was on everything that mattered. That illusion lasted until the investors arrived. They wanted faster returns, new patents, more noise. That was when the consultants showed up with sleek presentations about vision alignment. They didn't talk to engineers. They talked to shareholders. The energy in the building changed, colder now, efficient in all the wrong ways. I watched it happen with the same detached calm I used when debugging a corrupted system, observing the fault line forming but not yet sure where it would break. I didn't realize then that the break was already written into the company's DNA, and I was about to become the test case for what happens when loyalty meets greed. The shift didn't come overnight, but it felt like it did. One Monday morning, I walked into NovaForge, and the entire energy had changed. The walls were still glass, the slogans still glowed, but the air carried something sterile, an efficiency that reeked of control. Marcus had announced a strategic partnership with Horizon Equity, the kind of name that promised innovation while quietly gutting it. They didn't invest to build, they invested to harvest. Within weeks, the old leadership team was gone, replaced by polished newcomers who spoke in buzzwords but didn't know how to wire a sensor. That's when Evelyn Hart arrived, the new head of strategy. She was all teeth and confidence, a human presentation deck. She walked through the labs like a tourist in a museum, touching nothing but taking mental notes on everything. In her first meeting with the engineering division, she smiled like a teacher addressing children. "We're building a new culture," she said, "one that prioritizes collaboration and agility." Every word made my skin crawl. Collaboration was their code for control. Agility meant obedience. Marcus barely looked at me anymore. When he did, it was through her. Evelyn had become his translator, his mouthpiece, the polished version of every decision he didn't have the courage to say aloud. My projects were suddenly under review. Budgets slashed, timelines tripled. I was told to delegate more, to trust the process. I'd spent 15 years trusting the process, and it had gotten us here. But this wasn't about efficiency. It was about erasing fingerprints. My name had become too visible in the company's foundation, and that made people like Evelyn nervous. I watched as she restructured my department, placing 2 innovation leads between me and my team. One of them was a recent hire, a data analyst who called hardware legacy systems. The other was a management consultant who thought patents were just marketing tools. They reported directly to her, not me. It was brilliant in a way, a slow suffocation disguised as progress. The moment I realized the full scope of their plan came during a quarterly meeting. Marcus stood at the front of the auditorium, all charm and confidence, unveiling the NovaCore initiative, a fully integrated robotics platform designed to redefine industrial automation. It was my work, my architecture, my protocols, the same design I'd been developing for 3 years under a different project name. I sat there in silence while he explained our breakthrough system to investors, crediting the innovation to the collective genius of NovaForge. Evelyn's eyes met mine briefly during the applause. Her smile said everything. They'd just stolen my life's work and wrapped it in a press release. The applause roared, but all I heard was the low hum of betrayal. I walked back to my office, or rather, what used to be my office. A notice on the door informed me that I'd been relocated to an open workspace for cross-departmental synergy. My belongings had been neatly boxed and stacked against the wall. A cactus I'd kept alive for 10 years sat on top, its soil dry, like even it knew the game was changing. That night, for the first time, I didn't stay late to fix things. I just sat there in that shared, fluorescent-lit space and realized that the company I built was no longer mine. The worst part wasn't losing the title. It was realizing that Marcus had become everything we used to fight against, and I'd let him do it under my nose. The invitation arrived as a calendar alert. No explanation, no agenda. Global demo rehearsal, mandatory attendance. I almost deleted it, assuming it was another investor show. But something in the tone, clinical, deliberate, made me go. When I entered the presentation hall, I recognized none of the faces. Rows of new executives, PR consultants, and marketing people with cold smiles. Evelyn was at the podium, all polish and posture. Marcus stood beside her, wearing a confidence that looked borrowed. I sat in the back, unnoticed, notebook in hand, pretending to belong. The screen behind them displayed the title, Introducing NovaCore Robotics Platform. The name hit me like a slap. NovaCore was my internal code name, the one I used for 3 years, never approved for public use. I leaned forward as the slides changed. There it was, my system, my entire design language, the modular control protocols I'd built line by line. They'd rebranded it, stripped my name, and called it a NovaForge Original. Evelyn spoke like a practiced evangelist. This framework will redefine how industries automate, adaptive learning, seamless control, scalable integration. I mouthed the words with her because they were mine. Every phrase came straight from my documentation. When the demo began, I watched the robot arm move with familiar precision, every motion a reflection of my own late nights. They even kept the calibration quirks I'd never fixed, the same pauses I once called its heartbeat. It wasn't anger I felt, it was disorientation, like watching someone steal your reflection. And then it got worse. Evelyn smiled at the audience. Before we begin our investor preview next week, we'd like to acknowledge the extraordinary leadership that made this innovation possible. The lights dimmed, and a short video began to play, a montage of faces, none of them mine. Marcus appeared, talking about vision, about building a legacy. My name was never mentioned, not once. When the applause hit, I stayed seated. No one noticed the woman in the back row with clenched fists and a hollow stare. I walked out before the lights came up. I didn't even grab my bag. The corridor outside felt colder than usual, sterile and humming. As I passed the reception desk, I saw something that made me stop. A new display. Glass encased, backlit with soft white light, featuring NovaForge's innovation team. 12 portraits arranged in a grid. My photo was gone. It had been there since year 10, between Marcus and the original CTO, replaced by Evelyn's glossy headshot. My absence was seamless, like I'd never existed. When I returned to my workspace, my keycard denied access. I stood there staring at the red light, waiting for it to change, as if stubbornness could override security. A facilities manager passing by said cheerfully, "Oh, your clearance was updated. You're on level 1 now, collaborative space." He said it like it was a gift. Level 1 was the open bullpen for interns and short-term contractors. My heart sank, but my face stayed still. I went downstairs, found my new desk wedged between two noisy project pods, and sat down. No nameplate, no privacy, just the steady hum of cheap fluorescent lights and the whine of a printer that needed toner. I wanted to scream, but instead I opened my laptop and kept working. Not for them, not anymore, but for myself. Every email, every document, every meeting summary, I started saving copies off network. I built an encrypted archive labeling everything with timestamps, patent references, attribution notes. I knew what this was, a slow purge designed to push me out quietly, but I wasn't leaving, not yet. I watched from that crowded floor as Evelyn strutted through the hallways like a queen surveying her conquered land. People avoided my eyes. Some whispered, others looked away. The story spreading. Internally was that I'd stepped back, that I'd chosen to focus on mentoring. The lies multiplied faster than I could track them. The next week, they rolled out the official press release. My design was now the foundation of NovaForge's next evolution. My name didn't appear in a single line. That night, I stayed in the office long after everyone left, sitting under the hum of dead light, staring at the prototype arm that had built this empire. I whispered to it, "They think you're theirs." The machine whirred faintly, like it remembered. That was when I knew this wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure, and I wasn't about to let them bury me quietly. The day after the demo, I didn't go to the office. I sat in my apartment surrounded by old notebooks, hard drives, and scraps of memory that smelled faintly of solder and exhaustion. Every achievement I'd ever earned had been folded into someone else's narrative. My name erased, my voice silenced, my identity reduced to former engineer. I made coffee, let it go cold, and stared at the contract I'd kept all these years, tucked inside a folder labeled simply original. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but the clause that mattered still read clear as sunlight. Termination without cause or failure of proper intellectual attribution reverts all proprietary frameworks, systems, and patents to the original creator. Clause 12C. Marcus had signed it himself, back when we were all just kids in a warehouse. I'd almost forgotten it existed. Almost. As I reread it, something sharp settled in my chest. Not anger, not even satisfaction, but clarity. I knew what they'd done was illegal. What I didn't know was how far they'd go to cover it up. I picked up my phone and called Lydia Crane, an old friend turned IP attorney who once joked she'd defend me for free if I ever needed her. "You still take pro bono cases?" I asked. She laughed softly. "Depends on who's bleeding." I told her everything. No dramatics, no embellishment, just the facts. The rebranding, the missing credits, the restricted access. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Ruby," she said finally, "they're trying to erase the chain of authorship. That's not oversight. That's theft." I heard typing on the other end, fast and methodical. "Do you still have the notarized copy?" "I do." "Then you hold the detonator," she said. "They just don't know it yet." We met the next morning at a diner that still smelled like syrup and diesel, the kind of place where no one cared about billion-dollar corporations. Lydia arrived in a gray suit, hair pulled back, legal pad in hand. She spread the documents across the booth like evidence in a trial. "You know what this means?" she asked. "If they terminate you, or even imply you're obsolete, Clause 12C triggers automatically. Every patent tied to your authorship reverts to you, and since the NovaCore platform is built entirely on your architecture, they're using stolen property." I finished for her. She nodded. We'll file a reversion claim before they realize they've stepped on a landmine. We spent hours drafting the notice. She was calm, deliberate, and merciless. I provided timestamps, design documents, internal memos showing my authorship. Every line was proof, every attachment a nail in the coffin they'd built for themselves. When it was ready, Lydia sealed the envelope with a neat press of her hand. We send this certified to legal, Marcus Dane personally, and every member of their board. Once they open it, there's no putting this genie back in the bottle. I signed my name slowly, feeling every stroke of the pen. The last time I'd done that, I was a hopeful engineer signing a dream into being. Now it felt like I was signing a declaration of war. That evening, as the sun fell behind the skyline, I stood on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on, one by one. Somewhere in that glow, NovaForge was humming with artificial confidence, blissfully unaware that their clock was ticking. Lydia texted me just before midnight. Delivered. Timestamped. Certified. I stared at the message for a long time. After years of silence and survival, I finally had the one thing they couldn't erase. A clause, a contract, and the courage to use it. The next move was theirs, but the game, for the first time in years, was mine. The first call came the next morning at 9:12 a.m. Unknown number, blocked ID. I let it ring. The second came from HR, the third from Marcus himself. I didn't answer any of them. By noon, Lydia texted, "They've read it. Brace yourself." It was almost satisfying how predictable they were. First denial, then panic, then bargaining. The official email arrived 30 minutes later, full of corporate calm. "We believe there may have been a misunderstanding regarding intellectual property assignment." I almost laughed. They weren't even trying to hide the fear. By 3 p.m., Lydia confirmed that their lawyers had requested an urgent meeting. "They'll try to intimidate you," she said. "They'll use money, guilt, and maybe nostalgia. Let them talk. We'll let the contract do the work." The next day, we met at a law firm downtown, the kind with marble floors and coffee that costs as much as rent. The conference room overlooked the skyline, sterile, perfect, suffocating. Marcus sat at the head of the table, pale but composed. Evelyn was beside him, posture sharp, mask intact. Across from them were two attorneys I didn't recognize, both flipping through thick binders that probably cost more than my car. Lydia and I sat opposite, just two people with one folder that could sync them. "Ruby," Marcus began, forcing a smile, "we've always valued your contributions." Lydia cut him off. "We're not here for pleasantries. You've violated Clause 12C of Ms. Maren's original employment agreement. You used her patented framework without authorization. The reversion notice has already been filed. We're here to discuss terms." The room chilled instantly. One of the lawyers leaned forward. "Those patents were created during her employment. That makes them company property." Lydia slid a highlighted page across the table. "Read it, Clause 12C, signed and notarized. It explicitly states that ownership reverts to the inventor if attribution is removed or if termination occurs without cause. You erased her name from public filings, marketing, and internal documentation. That's breach and forfeiture. Effective immediately, those patents are hers." Evelyn's voice cracked slightly when she spoke. "You're bluffing." I finally looked up. "Try me." Silence stretched so long you could hear the hum of the city through the glass. Marcus exhaled slowly. "What do you want, Ruby?" I smiled faintly. "My technology. All of it. Transferred back under my ownership. Then we negotiate licensing, on my terms." Lydia slid a document forward. "Here are the proposed conditions. A 5-year exclusive license to NovaForge, 10% of gross revenue from all products built on her framework, and $4 million annually as a base licensing fee. In addition, public acknowledgement of her authorship and reinstatement to the board with full voting rights." The younger attorney scoffed. "That's extortion." Lydia didn't blink. "That's enforcement." Evelyn leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You'd destroy this company just to prove a point?" "No," I said quietly. "I'd let it destroy itself. You built your empire on my work. Without a license, every contract you've signed is fraudulent. Every client could sue you tomorrow." Marcus rubbed his temples, looking smaller by the second. "This could ruin us," he muttered. "You did that," I said. "I just wrote better paperwork." They asked for 24 hours to confer with the board. Lydia gave them 12. We stood, gathered our things, and walked out. Outside, the air smelled different, lighter, cleaner, like the storm had finally broken. Lydia glanced over at me as we reached the elevator. "They'll sign," she said, "because they have no choice." For the first time in years, I believed her. They signed 2 days later. The agreement arrived by courier, still warm from the printer, every clause intact, every demand met. Marcus's signature looked smaller than I remembered, shaky even. The settlement transferred full ownership of my technology back to me, along with the licensing rights that would keep NovaForge alive only if they followed my terms to the letter. The public apology came next, a company-wide email sent by Evelyn herself, acknowledging my authorship and unintentional oversights and attribution. It went viral within hours. Industry headlines called it the IP, reckoning. But for me, it wasn't revenge, it was balance. The money arrived in clean digital numbers, but it was never about that. It was about seeing my name where it belonged, about proving that creators deserve to own what they build. I took my first real day off in years, sitting in the quiet of my workshop, the hum of machines finally peaceful. I'd already filed for new patents, under my name, my terms. A few months later, I launched the Redline Collective, a mentorship program for engineers who'd been silenced, undercredited, or stolen from. I taught them how to protect their work, how to write clauses that couldn't be erased. When one of my mentees called to say she'd just filed her first patent, her voice shaking with pride, I smiled. This was what victory looked like, not destruction, but creation. They tried to erase me, but I turned their blueprint into my foundation, and this time it's mine forever. Looking back, I learned that silence can be both a shield and a weapon. For years, I believed that hard work spoke for itself, that if I stayed loyal, fair, and focused, the right people would see my worth. They didn't. They saw an opportunity. What saved me wasn't luck or power. It was documentation, preparation, and the refusal to let anyone convince me I didn't matter. The truth is, most betrayals don't come with warning signs. They arrive disguised as promotions, compliments, or new directions. When it happens, you have two choices: react in anger and burn everything, or step back and plan your strike in silence. I chose silence. I learned that contracts are just words until you understand their power, and that fairness in business doesn't come from goodwill, it comes from leverage, and leverage comes from knowledge. When Marcus and Evelyn faced the consequences, I didn't feel triumph. I felt peace. The kind that comes from knowing I finally drew a line they couldn't cross. I didn't destroy them, I just made them face what they'd built on lies. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. The trick is knowing when to use which. You can't control how people treat you, but you can control the evidence you leave behind, the boundaries you enforce, and the story you're willing to tell about yourself. How to get started today. Keep written proof, emails, agreements, ideas, timelines. Because memory fades, but records don't. Read every contract twice before signing anything. Ask questions, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Never downplay your contributions. Document them, own them, and remind others of your role when needed. Build quiet alliances, people who see your worth even when you're being silenced. And most importantly, don't waste your anger. Channel it into clarity and strategy. If you've ever been underestimated, erased, or made to feel small, share your story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this. And remember, Sometimes justice doesn't need noise. It just needs proof.